The valley that birthed the wolf legend. Deep within the folded hollows of West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, there were places where the reach of civilization weakened, then failed altogether. Valleys where roads never finished being built. Where laws arrived late, if they arrived at all. And where families, once settled, could vanish from the rest of the world for generations without leaving more than a whisper behind. In one such hollow, hidden by ridgelines and fog, a lineage took root that would eventually blur the line between documented history and American myth. This is not a campfire tale. It is not folklore passed down through drunken stories or exaggerated memory. What follows is the recorded history of the Blackburn clan, a family whose bloodline folded inward on itself so completely that it gave rise to legends still spoken in the mountains more than a century later. The first known outsider to encounter them in a formal capacity was Dr. William Fletcher, a physician and anthropologist commissioned by a newly established federal bureau in the late 19th century. His task was straightforward: travel into the most remote Appalachian communities and document their health conditions, living arrangements, and genealogies. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the autumn of 1887, Fletcher recorded his arrival in a narrow valley near the Kentucky's West Virginia border, a place locals referred to only as the Pit. The name, he noted, was spoken quietly, never casually. Upon my arrival at the settlement, Fletcher wrote in his field journal dated October 12, 1887. I was met not with curiosity, but suspicion. The individuals who emerged from the tree line displayed physical characteristics so unusual that I momentarily questioned whether I had encountered an entirely separate classification of human beings. He described hunched frames and elongated facial structures. I set close together. Jaws heavy and uneven. Canine teeth extending far beyond what he considered normal human proportion. Even in his measured, clinical language, unease bleeds through the ink. The Blackburn clan had established their homestead decades earlier, sometime in the early 1820s. The family's patriarch, Jeremiah Blackburn, was a Scottish immigrant fleeing murder charges back east. Rather than risk trial, he vanished into the mountains with his two brothers. Their wives came with them, women who were not merely related by marriage, but by blood. The founding population of the Blackburn settlement consisted entirely of close relatives. From the beginning, their genetic pool was narrow. Over time, it would become a closed system. Geography ensured it. The valley they chose could only be reached through a single mountain pass, narrow, steep, and frequently rendered impassable by snow and landslides. Historical weather records indicate that during certain winters, the pass remained blocked for months at a time, cutting the family off entirely from the outside world. Isolation became routine. Suspicion hardened into doctrine. Outsiders were not merely unwelcome, they were considered dangerous. As years passed, the Blackburns married only among themselves. Cousins became spouses. Aunts, uncles, and nieces blurred into one another across generations. New blood never entered the lineage. By the time Dr. Fletcher encountered them in 1887, the clan numbered 38 individuals divided among three closely connected family units. Every one of them traced directly back to the original brothers. What set this case apart, even among other isolated Appalachian families, was not simply the presence of consanguinity, but the extreme concentration of physical traits it produced. Fletcher documented excessive hair growth covering much of the body, a condition later identified as congenital hypertrichosis. In some individuals, hair extended across the face, neck, shoulders, spine, and limbs, leaving little visible skin exposed. Equally striking were the dental abnormalities. Canine teeth elongated well beyond the gum line. Jaws thickened and asymmetrical. Bite patterns distorted to the point of affecting speech. These traits appeared throughout the clan in varying combinations, giving the family an appearance so unusual that nearby communities had already begun whispering about wolf people living in the mountains. Fletcher's records include meticulous sketches, drawn with the steady hand of a scientist trying desperately to remain objective. One subject in particular received extensive attention. Jacob Blackburn. Age 42. The subject displays hair coverage across approximately 85% of exposed skin, Fletcher wrote. Growth is densest along the spinal column, shoulders, and facial region. Dentition deviates significantly from human norms. Upper canines extend roughly 7/10 of an inch beyond the gum line, producing a resemblance to canine dentition that is deeply unsettling. Yet behind the sketches and measurements was a human reality rarely acknowledged in later retellings. The Blackburns were not monsters. They were not feral. They were a family trapped by geography, fear, and their own bloodline. As stories of the wolf family spread beyond the mountains in the late 1800s, they began to fuse with existing European werewolf myths, slowly embedding themselves into American folklore. By the turn of the century, the legend had taken on a life of its own. What most people never saw was the cost. Modern geneticists reviewing Fletcher's records would later conclude that the Blackburn's appearance resulted from recessive genes, traits that would remain hidden in a diverse population, but which became increasingly dominant within the family's closed genetic system. The true tragedy, according to sociologist Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, was not their physical condition, but the social response to it. They were imprisoned twice over, Harmon wrote in her 2010 analysis. First by the mountains themselves, and second by the fear their appearance inspired in others. That fear would soon turn deadly. The winter of 1888 descended on Appalachia with a violence unmatched in living memory. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowfall buried entire communities. Even established towns struggled to survive. For the Blackburns, already living on the margins, the season proved catastrophic. By December, the mountain pass sealing their valley disappeared beneath ice and snow. Hunting yields collapsed as wildlife vanished from the frozen landscape. Food stores dwindled, then vanished altogether. Starvation set in quietly. The winter of '88 was unlike anything these mountains had known, wrote trapper Luther Hopkins, who would encounter survivors the following spring. Even the hardiest folk were pushed to the edge. For those already isolated, it must have felt like the end of the world. By January of 1889, desperation drove members of the clan beyond their usual hunting grounds. It was during one such foray that the first blood was spilled. Jacob Blackburn and his 17-year-old son, Elijah, followed deer tracks near the valley's edge. Instead of prey, they encountered a hunting party from the nearby town of Millerton, the first outsiders they had seen in nearly 3 months. What happened next survives only through fragmented accounts and a single confession made years later. Thomas Ridley, one of the hunters, described the encounter in a statement given on his deathbed in 1905. "I thought we'd stumbled onto demons," he said. Jacob came toward us speaking in that strange, thick voice of theirs. His face was rimmed with frost, hair everywhere, teeth like an animal's. I swear to God I believed he wasn't human. The hunters fired. Jacob Blackburn died where he stood. Elijah, wounded but alive, fled back into the trees and carried the news home. That moment marked the beginning of what historians now refer to as the purging, a coordinated campaign driven by fear, superstition, and desperation. And it would only get worse. The purging and the fracture of blood. Jacob Blackburn's death did not remain an isolated act of violence. In the mountains, fear moves faster than truth. Within days of the shooting, word spread through the surrounding settlements that something unnatural had been encountered near the valley. The details changed with every retelling. Some said the creatures walked upright like men. Others insisted they ran on all fours. A few claimed they spoke in broken, animalistic sounds. None of it mattered. What mattered was that a name had finally been attached to the fear that winter had already planted in people's minds. Anthropologist Margaret Callaway would later describe the moment with chilling clarity. When hardship reaches a certain threshold, she wrote in her 1967 study of Appalachian isolation, communities look for something to blame. The Blackburns became that something. The winter of 1888 had stripped the region to its bones. Livestock froze. Crops failed. Children died of exposure in cabins no warmer than the air outside. In such conditions, superstition didn't merely survive, it thrived. The Blackburns' appearance made them the perfect vessel for collective terror. By late January of 1889, rumors had hardened into conviction. Stories circulated of wolf-like figures stealing livestock under cover of darkness. Others whispered that children had gone missing, though no record support such claims. Evidence was irrelevant. Fear had already filled in the gaps. Armed groups began organizing. At first, these were small hunting parties, men who claimed they were merely investigating. But by February, the tone had shifted. The language changed from curiosity to elimination. On February 17, 1889, a group of roughly 30 armed men from 3 neighboring communities converged on the Blackburn Valley. What they found there bore little resemblance to the monstrous threat they had imagined. The settlement was already collapsing. Historian Dr. Robert Keller later reviewed the accounts left by members of that expedition. The descriptions speak not of predators, Keller notes, but of people in the final stages of starvation. Cabins stood half buried in snow. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Children were visibly malnourished, their bellies distended from hunger. Adults moved slowly, weakened by weeks of inadequate food. At least 4 fresh graves were visible, hacked into frozen earth. None of it softened the intruders. Fear does not negotiate. Rather than offering aid, the armed party issued an ultimatum. The Blackburns were given 3 days to abandon the valley. If they remained, they would be removed by force. There was no discussion. No appeal. No mercy. With nowhere else to turn, the surviving members of the clan gathered what little they could carry and prepared to leave the only home most of them had ever known. The departure shattered the family. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the Blackburns fractured into smaller units, each group following a different survival instinct. Some sought deeper isolation, retreating into regions even less accessible than the valley they were forced to abandon. Others, weakened and desperate, drifted toward the edges of settled areas, attempting, often unsuccessfully, to pass unnoticed among the broader population. This dispersal would permanently alter the trajectory of the Blackburn bloodline. The largest group was led by Elijah Blackburn. Still bearing the physical scars from the shooting that killed his father, and now carrying the psychological weight of leadership, Elijah guided his faction northeast into a region locals called Devil's Backbone, a jagged limestone ridge known for its caves, sinkholes, and sheer inaccessibility. There, nearly 20 miles from their original settlement, they disappeared again. For almost 20 years, no verified outsider would lay eyes on them. Genetic historian Dr. Thomas Wells identifies this period as a critical inflection point. The winter of 1888–89 created a population bottleneck, Wells explains. Deaths, displacement, and the division into smaller breeding groups dramatically intensified the genetic concentration of existing traits. In simple terms, the persecution that targeted the Blackburns for their appearance forced them into conditions that ensured those very traits would become even more pronounced. It was a cruel feedback loop. Isolation produced difference. Difference produced fear. Fear enforced deeper isolation. By the turn of the century, the Blackburns had already begun to transform from a hidden community into something more myth than memory. Stories of the wolf people persisted, but details grew hazier with each retelling. Locations shifted. Numbers changed. Exaggeration replaced documentation. Then, in 1907, the legend collided with science once more. A young physician named Dr. Howard Grant arrived in McDowell County fresh from Johns Hopkins University. His assignment was unremarkable: establish a rural medical practice serving scattered mountain communities. His academic background, however, included a particular interest in the emerging field of human genetics. He did not come looking for the Blackburns. They came to him. Grant later wrote that almost every patient he treated during his first weeks in the region offered some warning about the mountains beyond the roads. Nearly all felt compelled to tell me about the wolf people, he noted in his journal. I dismissed these stories as superstition, no different from tales of witches or spirits. I would soon learn how mistaken I was. On July 8, 1907, a local trapper named Silas Moore arrived at Grant's clinic with an injured boy. The young man's appearance matched the folklore with unsettling precision. Dense hair covered much of his exposed skin. His posture was slightly hunched. His teeth, particularly the canines, extended noticeably beyond the norm. He spoke little, and when he did, his dialect sounded archaic, unfamiliar. His name was Isaac Blackburn. 16 years old. He had fallen from a ridge while hunting, suffering an open fracture in his leg. The wound showed signs of crude treatment, herbal poultices, improvised splints, but infection had already taken hold. Grant immediately recognized the danger. More remarkable than the injury, however, were Isaac's physical characteristics. With his training, Grant understood what others had not. This was not disease. Not curse. Not monstrosity. This was inheritance. After stabilizing the fracture and treating the infection, Grant began cautiously earning the boy's trust. Over weeks of conversation, barriers slowly fell. Isaac spoke of a hidden settlement deep within a limestone cave system. 3 main family groups. All descended from the same ancestors. No outsiders. No exceptions. Grant recorded his realization in September of that year. Marriages within the community have been exclusively endogamous for at least 4 generations, he wrote. First cousins predominate. More distant boundaries appear not to exist. For the first time, the Blackburn story was being documented not through fear, but through understanding. Yet with that understanding came an ethical dilemma. Grant knew that outside attention had already destroyed one Blackburn settlement. Another intrusion, even a well-intentioned one, could be fatal. Still, doing nothing meant abandoning a community in need of medical care. After weeks of deliberation, he made a decision. He would reach out, but only on the Blackburns' terms. Isaac agreed to carry a message to his father. Weeks later, the reply arrived. Elijah Blackburn would meet him. Alone. Away from the settlement. On neutral ground. The meeting was set for October 23, 1907, at a remote hunting cabin. What happened there would change the fate of the Blackburns forever. The Pact of Silence. The hunting cabin stood abandoned at the edge of a narrow ravine, its roof bowed under years of neglect, its walls silvered by weather and time. It was the kind of place no one visited unless they wished not to be seen. Dr. Howard Grant arrived just after dawn. He noted later that the woods were unnaturally quiet. No birds. No wind. Only the faint sound of water moving somewhere far below the ridge. Elijah Blackburn emerged from the trees without warning. Grant would describe the moment in his clinical notes, but even stripped of emotion, the encounter carried weight. The subject exhibits the most extensive manifestation of the family's traits I have yet observed, Grant wrote. Near total hypertrichosis. Dentition extending significantly beyond typical human parameters. Musculature unusually dense. Posture guarded but controlled. Elijah was in his mid-30s, though hardship made him appear older. Hair framed his face and spilled across his shoulders. His eyes, however, were sharp, calculating, alert, and unmistakably intelligent. Despite the physical intimidation his presence carried, Elijah did not threaten the doctor. He studied him. They spoke cautiously at first, both aware that this meeting balanced on a knife's edge. Grant explained his profession, his treatment of Isaac, and his interest in providing medical care, nothing more. Elijah listened in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. Grant would later note that Elijah understood far more than he had expected. He comprehends that their differences arise from blood relations, Grant recorded. Though he frames it in ancestral terms rather than scientific language. More striking still, Elijah openly acknowledged something that had gone unspoken for generations. He knew that introducing outsiders into the bloodline would change future generations. He knew what isolation had done to them. And yet, he feared what the outside world would do even more. That morning, an agreement took shape, one unlike anything documented before or since. Dr. Grant would be allowed to visit the Blackburn settlement. He would provide medical treatment where needed. He would document their lineage, health, and history. In return, he would never reveal their location. Never publish identifying details. Never bring outsiders. He would become their intermediary, their shield. Grant accepted without hesitation. For nearly 7 years, the arrangement held. Under cover of secrecy, Grant made periodic visits to the settlement hidden within the limestone caves of Devil's Backbone. His records from this period form the most detailed account of a genetically isolated human population in American history. He examined 31 members of the extended clan, compiled exhaustive genealogical charts, documented cultural practices developed entirely within isolation. What he found defied the monstrous narratives already circulating beyond the mountains. The Blackburns were not feral. They were organized. They possessed an intricate oral tradition, strict codes of behavior, and a shared understanding of their difference. They do not perceive their traits as deformities, Grant wrote in his 1914 summary. Within their culture, these characteristics signify belonging. Their stories reframed isolation as destiny, difference as purpose. It was a psychological adaptation, one that allowed dignity to survive where shame might otherwise have taken root. Grant kept his promise. When portions of his research appeared in obscure medical journals, they were published under pseudonyms. Locations were obscured. Names altered. The Blackburns remained hidden. But secrecy has a shelf life. During the 1920s, America developed a growing appetite for the strange and the macabre. Pulp magazines flourished, feeding readers stories of monsters lurking in forgotten corners of the country. The legend of the wolf people resurfaced, this time amplified. By 1925, at least 17 pulp publications referenced a so-called wolf family of West Virginia. None bore any resemblance to the real Blackburns. They were portrayed as savage, predatory, almost supernatural. One publication in particular ignited renewed interest. The October 1927 issue of Weird Tales of the Mountains featured a lurid cover, a wolf-like humanoid attacking travelers on a forest path. The accompanying story, The Beasts of Devil's Backbone, claimed to be based on true accounts. It was fiction. But fiction has consequences. At the same time, Appalachia itself was changing. Coal companies carved roads into mountains once thought inaccessible. Rail lines pushed into valleys that had known only footpaths. Logging operations stripped forests that had shielded entire communities from view. The physical barriers protecting the Blackburns were being dismantled. Historian Dr. William Summerfield describes the period bluntly. Between 1925 and 1935, the Blackburns faced extinction, not through disease or starvation, but exposure. That exposure came sooner than anyone expected. In the summer of 1931, a geological survey team mapping limestone formations in McDowell County stumbled upon one of the smaller Blackburn settlements, 3 families led by Thomas Blackburn, Elijah's nephew. The team's official report was clinical, almost sterile. Encountered approximately 12 to 15 individuals inhabiting a modified cave system, it read. Subjects display unusual physical characteristics including excessive hair growth and dental abnormalities. Team withdrew after defensive behavior observed. What the report did not mention was the camera. One of the surveyors, Charles Holloway, took several photographs before retreating. Those images would change everything. On August 3, 1931, the Charleston Gazette ran a front-page story. Wolf People of Appalachia, myth confirmed. Alongside the headline was a photograph of 3 Blackburn men standing at the mouth of their cave dwelling, hair-covered, hollow-eyed, unmistakably human. The article described them as beings deformed by generations of improper relations, language that fused sensationalism with cruelty. The damage was immediate. Within weeks, the mountains filled with outsiders, reporters, curiosity seekers, self-proclaimed monster hunters. Some carried notebooks and cameras. Others carried ropes. August through October of 1931 became, in effect, an organized hunt. Sociologist Dr. Rebecca Thornton later identified at least 27 documented expeditions during that period. This was not exploration, she wrote. It was pursuit. One journalist, James Harrison of the Pittsburgh Courier, joined such a group and fled it. What began as reporting has become something darker, he wrote in his journal. The men speak openly of capturing one of the wolf people for exhibition. I am leaving at first light. For the Blackburns, the choice was stark. Remain and be found, or vanish again. Elijah chose disappearance. In the fall of 1931, the main Blackburn settlement abandoned Devil's Backbone after more than 4 decades. They retreated north into the most inaccessible regions of what is now the Monongahela National Forest. It would be the last confirmed relocation of the clan as a unified group. After that, the trail fades. The quiet vanishing. After the fall of 1931, the Blackburn ceased to exist as a visible community. No more settlements were discovered. No more confirmed photographs emerged. No more first-hand encounters entered the public record. What remained were fragments, county documents, half-remembered stories, and the slow, unglamorous evidence of disappearance. By 1932, the nation's attention shifted elsewhere. The Great Depression tightened its grip, and curiosity about wolf people in the mountains lost its urgency. Expeditions dwindled. Roads led inward, not outward. The hunt ended not with resolution, but with neglect. For the Blackburn clan, this lull was not relief, it was survival. The prolonged persecution of 1931 had taken a toll. Several elder members died during the forced relocation, weakened by stress and exposure. Younger members, those born after the turn of the century, began questioning whether the life their ancestors had chosen could continue in a world that was rapidly shrinking. Anthropological evidence suggests a critical ideological split occurred between 1932 and 1935. Elijah Blackburn, now in his late 50s, represented the old guard. He believed isolation was the only defense against cruelty. To him, retreat was not cowardice, it was preservation. But younger members had seen the outside world. Some had interacted briefly with miners, traders, or doctors. They had learned that fear did not define everyone beyond the ridges. These younger Blackburns began advocating for something radical within their culture: limited exogamy. New blood. Not abandonment of identity, but adaptation. This internal conflict did not erupt into violence. It unfolded quietly, through separation. Small family units drifted away from the core settlement, settling nearer to marginal towns or isolated farms. Some changed their surnames. Others simply stopped speaking of their past. Modernization finished what fear had begun. The mid-20th century transformed Appalachia. Electrification reached valleys once ruled by lantern light. Roads replaced footpaths. Government agencies expanded their presence into regions long neglected. By 1950, truly isolated communities had become nearly impossible. Regional historian Dr. Emma Cartwright explains the impact succinctly. The strategy of vanishing into the mountains no longer worked, she notes. The mountains themselves were being mapped, logged, and regulated. The last verified physical evidence of the Blackburns as a distinct settlement comes from an unlikely source. In 1953, a United States Geological Survey aerial mapping project photographed a small clearing deep within the northeastern reaches of the Monongahela National Forest. Analysts later identified approximately 68 crude structures arranged in a pattern consistent with long-term habitation rather than recreational use. The location has never been publicly disclosed. Historians widely accept it as the final known residence of the primary Blackburn lineage. What happened afterward was not dramatic. There was no massacre. No final confrontation. No extinction event. Instead, there was absorption. Genealogical research conducted in the 1990s by Dr. Laura Blackburn, no relation, revealed a pattern in county marriage and death records from the mid-1950s onward. Individuals bearing the Blackburn surname, born between roughly 1925 and 1935, began appearing in official documents across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. They married into established local families. They worked ordinary jobs. They lived unremarkable lives. Most notably, the extreme physical traits that had once defined the clan appeared less frequently and with reduced severity. This matched what genetics would predict. According to geneticist Dr. Sarah Cohen, the Blackburn traits, hypertrichosis, dental elongation, skeletal variation, were recessive. Once marriages outside the clan became common, expression declined rapidly. Within 2 or 3 generations, Cohen explains, visible manifestations would become rare or disappear entirely, though the genes themselves remain. Medical advances accelerated this normalization. Orthodontic care corrected dental abnormalities. Early electrolysis reduced excessive hair growth. Children born with milder traits faced treatment, not exile. By the 1960s, the Blackburns no longer stood apart. They blended in. One of the most poignant confirmations of this transition comes from a 1987 oral history interview. Mary Williams, identified through genealogical research as the great-granddaughter of Elijah Blackburn, was born in 1943. She displayed only faint signs of the family's legacy, slight hair growth on her arms and back, minor dental issues corrected in childhood. She spoke calmly. "My grandfather didn't like to talk about it," she said. "But he told me there was a time when our people had to hide because others couldn't see past how we looked." She paused. "He said they chose to fade. That it was safer for the children to look like everyone else, even if it meant losing something that once made them special." By the 1970s, the Blackburns had ceased to exist as a separate community. Their descendants were indistinguishable from the broader Appalachian population. Yet their story did not disappear. It transformed. Folklore filled the gaps left by fading memory. Campfire tales replaced census records. Horror films and novels borrowed the image but discarded the truth. Cultural anthropologist Dr. James Morrison frames the legacy clearly. "We turn human difference into monsters," he observes. And in doing so, we forget that these legends are born from fear, not the supernatural. Modern genetic testing suggests that thousands of Americans, particularly those with Appalachian roots, carry fragments of Blackburn DNA. The visible traits are gone. The lineage remains. The Blackburn story is not about werewolves. It is about isolation. About fear. About what happens when difference is punished instead of understood. In the mist-laden hollows where cell service still fails and trails disappear without warning, locals continue to tell stories of wolf people who once haunted the mountains. Few realize the truth. The monsters were never the Blackburns. They were created by the choices of those who refused to see them as human.